name's Michael Blumenthal. I've spent about 30 years in the healthcare data and technology space, with about half that time focused on retrieval and um, integration and enhancement of clinical data. And in my past life, I've worked with some of the folks that are on this call, so some familiar faces. I'm also an investor and advisor to Velux. So this is the first in a series of kind of like lunch and learns that we're going to do. And we tried to, we respect how busy everyone's time is. So we tried to limit them to 30-minute sessions. And that's why we've broken them into a couple of sessions. So excited to kick this off with Michael Campbell as our speaker. Michael will introduce themselves, but Michael is the VP of Quality and Consulting Services at Velux. So without further ado, Michael, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. We really thank you for joining. As Mike noted, today's webinar is really the first in a series of webinars that we're doing about clinical data operations, and really specifically for health plan quality managers. I'll be leading the series, and I'll be sharing with you our research findings and our observations and our recommendations really on the why and the how of optimizing your organization's data operations, or more specifically, your clinical data operations. In case you haven't noticed, our industry is, I say, collectively recalibrating from kind of legacy organizations really focused on payment and benefit design and coordination and reporting towards, I should say using to some extent both clinical data, but are we predominantly really retrospective payment claims data, to, I'll say, more automated, more agile, more digital first, data first organizations that are responsible for, I would say, orchestration of real-time, high frequency, low latency data, so that we can really prospectively identify and isolate and ultimately mitigate risk factors happening at the individual and contractual and organizational level. As Mike noted, we know there's a lot of, say, Southern Californians here, West Coasters. So given your proximity to the entertainment industry, I'm going to leverage an expression used in that industry of setting the scene. So we're going to talk today predominantly about what the market conditions are, both from a financial perspective and an operational perspective. And then there'll be a short kind of character introduction for myself. And then we'll really begin this story arc from where we are with our current clinical data operations, and to set kind of a future state where we're moving towards, so that we, as like kind of players in this scenario, really can overcome. I at times thought it was kind of hyperbolic to say this, but the more news I read recently, the more direct conversations I have with colleagues, I think we're really in a kind of an existential crisis. And to stay relevant and viable in this new paradigm, I think it's important that we really paint a roadmap for where we're going or where we should go strategically. So to that point, I'm going to share my screen, and let me know if somebody can let me know if they're not seeing everything they need to be seeing. You should see entirely the full screen title page.
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, we are. Okay, great. All right, so with that in mind, let's start right in. So in the health payer market, we have really two different phenomenon, we'll say, going on. So we have declining revenue growth, and we have increasing operating margin pressures. So on this top line, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that we see massive disenrollment occurring across the Medicaid rolls. In fact, one consultant referred to it as the most unprecedented disenrollment of American insurance in history. So we know that's predominantly coming from the redeterminations and the loss of eligibility for Medicaid membership. On the other side, on the ACA exchange segment, we know that there's ongoing dispute and debate about the enhanced subsidies, those expiring at the end of the year. I think it's likely that we would see, or going to see, continued exits from that market. I already have some evidence of that with some clients that I've spoken with. Or the other scenario is that they raise premiums so much that ultimately people simply drop coverage. On the Medicare Advantage, now that's been an exciting space to really keep an eye on. But for star ratings, we saw massive realignment and resorting of plans on their Medicare stars ratings for 2025. I think there was a pretty impressive recovery for 2026. But that said, we know that there's expected pressures and difficulties for plans to really hit those thresholds going forward. So it's going to be a challenging space to continue to recapture revenue. Here we are on day 28 officially of our government shutdown. So we know that there's continued constraints on government reimbursements. There's been no kind of shy messaging about the pressures that are going to be placed on a number of different segments, including the ACA rolls is just one example. I think the typical response we see for most plans is simply to raise premiums, and that's kind of been the go-to, I think, for as long as we all can remember. I saw one incident in reading about the impact of premium increases in Wisconsin, and it was a newspaper article that they were looking at increases of as much as 800%. I'm not talking about a meme coin or cryptocurrency. We're talking about 800% increase in premium. There's no doubt that's going to level off. So any increase in premiums is likely to be offset with people simply just choosing to not take coverage. On the bottom line, where we start to talk about operating margin pressures, it's been repeated, this mantra that we have higher utilization rates happening across all segments. And with this disenrollments that I mentioned earlier, we expect that the populations that do remain, just I think from a accounting standpoint, would be the sicker and older risk pools. And then we also know that with the ALR and MLR, those are continuing to see upward pressure. Many of the plans are exceeding what their desired thresholds are, somewhere in that 90% range, at least on the MLR. And then again, this new administration's made no qualms about communicating that they want more pervasive, more frequent, a broader breadth of audits, particularly on RADV. And that, of course, is precipitating additional audit cost as plans go into more defensive mode in preparation of potential audits. I know there's been some reprieve on that, but I think the message is pretty clear that there's going to be increased scrutiny, particularly for risk adjustment. So there's a heavy kind of focus on the regional market. I kind of skipped over, just in the interest of time, that many regional plans find themselves in this kind of existential crisis where they're referring to the importance of how do they survive going forward in this next, say, 2 years in particular. On the larger insurers, I don't think there's necessarily a better scenario. Maybe they have better access to equity, but there's no doubt that Wall Street, which tends to be kind of discriminating and I think in many ways very forgiving, has really pushed national insurers from this stable rating into this negative. It takes a lot to get into the negative slots, but unfortunately that's where we're finding ourselves as an industry. Again, they cite this increased utilization and rising medical costs amongst this kind of ongoing segment challenges between Medicare and Medicaid, and there's not a one solution fits all kind of scenario. I like to follow Grant Parkas. I've had many chances to talk with him, meet with him. We've used his quotes before. He's kind of a no BS. Let's talk about what things that need to be said. And he did a very, I think, discriminating review of the Molina's recent earnings call. And you'll see here some of the things that he referred to as there was a big earnings miss on estimates against estimates, 50%. I mean, you'll get punished by Wall Street for a 2% mix, but a 50% mix precipitated a 20% post-earnings drop, which again, I thought we were not dealing in meme coins, but sometimes when I look at these numbers, I start to wonder. Again, here you see we're exceeding the MLR at 92.6%, so we're way above what I think is a standard threshold that plans are hoping to maintain. But there's a lot of things that weren't said, and the things that I think maybe are happening in discussions internally, but there's no real clear purview as to where we're going. I think we know that utilization costs are going up, but we don't know if that's necessarily temporary or that's like a structural change. There's a lot of nuance. It has to be reviewed on the long-term impact of redeterminations. Is there state level differences happening there? Medicare stars, as I mentioned, and certainly HEDIS are continued important areas of operation and improvement, but to do so efficiently within each health plan. But there's not real clarity around many of those areas. Plans have really clearly, at least in some of these earnings calls and some of the internal discussions that we've had, have made it very clear they're not really in a position of trying to go aggressive on growing their top line. I think most plans are going into a defensive mode and really trying to prioritize bottom line, meaning that, how can we operate more efficiently? How can we restructure? How can we become more streamlined? What kind of workflow? And one of the consequences of that, as I think you have observed, and I've certainly observed it with many colleagues that I've spoken with, is there's job cuts, layoffs. I use all these different terminologies because I was kind of impressed with all the variants of job cuts that were put out there. Maybe if you have a couple, you want to put them in the chat. But my favorite actually was voluntary separation packages. It sounds like something that a divorce attorney would be using in a statement, but we definitely see that happening. I've observed it, and of course you have articles like this ongoing trending of payers that are cutting jobs, and we really look at a range of, like, say, 2% up to 20%, so rather significant job employment decreases. I mentioned earlier that we're going to see, I think, a number of plans just simply drop certain products like their ACA marketplace in particular. And then this is, for me, unprecedented. Maybe I haven't paid as much attention as I should, but a number of health plans are just simply ceasing operations. They don't have business models that are viable. They're not profitable, and maybe they're be loaded down with debt. So there's not even a buyer in some of these scenarios to come and pick them up on the cheap. So here's just a list of some of the plans that I'm aware of that are ceasing either all or, let's say, 95% of their operations. So this is the kind of this is where we're operating from a market perspective, as we start to then get into some additional challenges, but I also want to make sure we pivot on this being also an opportunity. There is a consultant who's had a deep experience in the industry named Lauren Dauto. I've had a chance to meet with her. She wrote a great white paper, which I have a reference to that at the end of the slides. And one of the statements I really like that she wrote is, the real shift is a deep structural rejection of opacity, fragmentation, and fee for denial control mechanisms. In its place, regulators are erecting data transparent, interoperable, and value-bound system with uncompromising rules and tight execution windows. And as an example of that, there's three kind of areas that I want to focus on. They're all pertinent to our discussion about efficient data operations. The first one is prior auth. I think everybody should be familiar with this new mandate that's coming in, but I think we've tend to over-focus on the mandate of interoperable prior auth APIs by January 1st, 2027. Actually, there's already provisions that need to be put into place now. Well, sorry, within the next 2 months, which in our space it probably means now. And it includes a number of public reporting metrics on denials, approvals, and delays. And there's very tight constraints about how timely plans need to be in response to prior auth requests. That's going to mandate some level of standardization, both internal in workflows, but also just in data exchange. A much higher level of transparency that I think we've typically been used to in the past. And of course, speed is critical in that scenario. Interoperability mandates, that's an area, of course, that we're really, really deep into, and it's part of the reason that VLOCs exist, is because we know that on top of the payer access APIs that were already supposed to be stood up as early as 2020, maybe 2021, I may be off a little bit on my dates there, but we know there's data exchange needing to occur between payer and payer also by January 1st, 2027. And then to some degree, all of these are variants of exchange of data between payers and providers. So that case as well, there needs to be standardization, speed, security has a component. It's one of the reasons that we're very strong proponents of FHIR because it has a number of different scoping and access security that are non-existent in the current industry with our current processes. And of course, the data quality standards of accuracy and completeness. You'll start to pick up, you're going to start picking up a lot more references to data quality and dimensions of data quality as key areas of strategy that we think really should be leveraged to be able to optimize your operations. And then risk adjustment. I'm not an expert in risk adjustment, but what I did discern from my reviews is that we're really moving away from this volume. The more codes that I can pad into the risk adjustment, obviously the higher score exists, and ultimately that increases payment. But there seems to be a shift towards really the plausibility that we're not just a blanket capture of codes and comorbidities, but what's the plausibility of these comorbidities existing given the other contexts of this member's utilization. So there definitely has to be an alignment amongst different departments within the health plan. Again, a much higher level of transparency, auditability as its own data criteria, and then of course accuracy and completeness. So these are, I refer to them as crisis simply because they're more pressure. They're going to obviously have a bottom line increase in costs, but when done and executed correctly, there's lots of evidence that you can actually make them strategic advantage, especially if you move early on them and start to build up your technical expertise and realign your workflows to optimize those interfaces. Like I mentioned, Velox, I mean, we're a very new company, but we are compiled of a number of different industry veterans. It's possible, I haven't necessarily counted the total number, but we may be pushing 2 centuries worth of experience across a number of different domains within the industry, including value-based care, software development with the focus on healthcare technology, database design, all these different aspects, risk adjustment, and as such. So we're really well situated with our technical expertise and our platform, and we really make it our mission to really help the industry address these key pain points as we move towards interoperability with a high prioritization around data quality and efficiency. Myself, I do know some of you on the call, and it's good to see you again, but many of you know that I've actually had many, many years and approaching nearly 3 decades as a certified HEDIS compliance auditor. Was actually part of the original pilot program in 1998, which was a partnership between CMS and NCQA and IPRO when we piloted the audit program at that time. During that time, I conducted hundreds of audits. I probably signed off on thousands and thousands of submissions. I really try to always go back to my origins and my academic background on really comparative health policy to understand kind of systemically where we are now and how that compares and what are the different variances that we can implement to become more efficient. I also have been deep in data modeling and management for a number of years, and I think in the last, say, nearly 10 years, I've really started to get more involved in data development, software development. FHIR, of course, is an area that I was starting in 2020. And various levels of involvement from being a tester to an educator to at least obtaining a proficiency certification in 2023. And then I was brought on board along with my IP to Velox in 2024, where, as Mike noted, I've been VP of Quality Solutions and Consulting since then. So that's kind of the macro picture of what's happening. That I think we can all kind of see that happening on an ongoing basis. And then let's get a little bit more micro and look at how things, as I've observed them really for the last, I'll say 10 years, but I haven't seen a dramatic shift, I'll be honest, in even the last 5 years, is that under our current data operations, we do still have a tendency to be latent and retrospective, like an over-reliance in many ways on administrative claims vis-a-vis clinical data. Of the clinical data that we do use, if it wasn't for CCDs, I think we could nearly say that there's zero use of clinical data format standards. CCDs, I think, is the one exception. And of course, we think the area that really needs to scale out, of course, is FHIR. I started asking questions as I got more and more, I'll say, academic about data management and started to bring that into the context of my audits and asking questions in about 2018 about health plans and understanding where they are with their data governance, their enterprise data management, and where they're even using frameworks, that they even have a data governance committee, what tools they were using. And I saw maturity levels that I think were certainly nowhere near what we see in banking, maybe better than what we see in education. But I always try to remind clients that, remember, we're talking about healthcare, life and death, patient safety, high liability, high risk. We should be much, much further along in our use of these standard frameworks. And then another area where I do acknowledge that every ETL analyst is certainly doing work around data quality metrics, but they tend to be more high levels. They focus on record count, reconciliation, certainly completeness at the field level, making sure there's no null values in a required field, for example. And we've done pretty good, I think, with a lot of validation of valid codes in areas like that. But there's not a standard framework. There's a lot of variability in what's considered to be priorities. There wasn't really a clear setup of what are the dimensions that we need to include for each set of data to be use case specific or fit for purpose for the variety of different use cases. We've recently become more sophisticated about that, and I think we're starting to finally move out of the kind of the academic world of data quality toward the more practical and applied world. Moving forward, I'll say future state, when we really are thinking about data operations as strategy, we move towards real-time or prospective and high trust. We move away again from administrative towards clinical data, really supply side, ideally from the authoritative source, i.e. the EHR, not through intermediaries. And then we ensure compliance with de jure formal standards. And the de jure means it's a mandate, it's a government mandate. And we certainly see that all over every legislation coming out of ASTP and CMS, a formal standard. And I say this just to clarify, I think there was for some time plans or clients indicating that, maybe this will just be a passing phase and FHIR will go away. A formal standard means that it's actually from an SDO like H Level 7, which has very strict ANSI compliance governance standards that it has to meet. And I will also say that FHIR is international. I do go to conferences as often as I can pertaining to FHIR in particular, and I'm impressed with how often people from all over the world participate and attend these conferences. So I really need to emphasize that FHIR is not going away. And then, like I mentioned, we need to move towards these defined data governance frameworks, ensure there's a proper governance structure with champions coming from the executive level of the plan, and a more holistic data management where we look not just at, say, data quality or just the ETL environment, but holistically looking at a complete inventory of all your data sources, classify data sources, capture the metadata about the data sources. And then those are combined with these, again, multidimensional data quality standards and tools to really ensure at least a minimum of accuracy, timeliness, completeness, and auditability across your data environment. Now, I think it's quite often, and I was always, I think many of you know that sometimes I could maybe sometimes get annoyed with certain responses I may receive as an auditor because I go in with a certain expectation. And I always appreciated how frank and honest people were in responding. But one area that always I think was problematic for me is that there was a tendency to treat outside of quality management that if something was data, really at the core of the data, like the quality of the data, the movement of the data, that somehow that was an IT concern and that would be delegated to them. I like this representation of the 3 layers of data infrastructure. And this was from a recent webinar I saw with Eugene Vesto, who was another guy I follow and met with just very recently last week. Did an interview of Sanderson and Freeman, where there's really 3 layers. Those first 2 layers are the database compute storage layer and the ETL or data transformation movement layer. That clearly falls within IT. There's a certain technical skill set that's needed. But once we hit that top layer of data management, that starts to really move out of the purview of IT. Certainly they need to be engaged because they're the ones pushing the data and the visibility of that data up to the business layer. But at that layer, it really needs to fall more broadly and become everybody's responsibility. And that's where we hit this components of data governance, inventory, and quality. There's another quote by Lauren Dauto, and I won't read the whole thing, but the part I do want to note is that plans that treat this as an IT problem are going to get blindsided. And that's a big reason why we want to help to create visibility around this concern and use VLOX in our technologies and our expertise to really help plans move and to prioritize and share accountability around this particular management of data. Okay, so this, again, I said this is the first in a series of webinars. We have a lot of other areas where we're really going to get more into the how of optimizing your data operations. Some of those components, this is not everything, but this is a couple key areas where I think we'll definitely be focusing on, which is building a data inventory and classifying each of your different data sources, understanding what data provenance is, and some things that are coming up regarding US CDI and US core that pertain to provenance, understanding what data lineage is and how to determine that and how to score your data channels according to data lineage. And then data quality dimensions and frameworks. So we have a more standard framework that we're referencing. And then ultimately, all this has to be provable at an ROI. And we feel that it's possible to do so and actually even stack ROI across a number of different use cases. So when you seek financing or budget around improving and optimizing your clinical data operations, that it's provable at an actual financial level. Okay, I think that's where we hit our timeline, our time limit. We still have some time for questions. I certainly encourage you to ask, and if not, I think Mike or someone else on the call may have a couple of questions that we can ask to be able to finish out with some momentum here. Okay. Oh, Mike, I don't hear you. You're on mute there.
Hey, Michael, one of the things I was seeing in my time with health plans is felt like folks are just kind of kicking the can down the road when it came to really figuring out clinical data strategy, really executing on FHIR and understanding where all their data stands. I think it's sort of, hey, let's see what NCQA and CMS are going to do. Like, what's your guidance there on when's the right time to pull the trigger? Are we too early? Are we too late? What happens if you don't pull the trigger soon enough?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I mean, I want to emphasize again some of the more immediate timelines that we're looking at, which kind of fall outside the purview typically of quality management, because I think the one that we're most concerned with within our community is around the movement towards digital quality measurement. And we know those timelines are all the way up to 2030. But in between now and then, we can continue to see NCQA deprecate the medical record review hybrid methodology. And certainly moving from large health plans, of which I think there's some rather large health plans on the call now, we know that moving from a population of 411 up to say 41,000, that's not something that scales easily, or I should say inexpensively or efficiently if you want to do prospective medical record review. So there's already an immediate need to start looking at solutions to start to address some of those data gaps. That's what we like to use as expression stacking ROI, because we know that data capture more broadly for HEDIS and other quality Medicare stars, it's still clinical data. And if you set the pipes correctly, you can more easily start to capture data that supports prior authorization, risk adjustment, care management, fraud, waste, and abuse. All of these ultimately can leverage the same pipes when you get this FHIR connection made. So I absolutely do not think it's too early. I think that the idea is that most plans that we've spoken with said they know they need to do something and they want to do something, they just don't know where to start. And what we've seen in advisement coming from a number of different plans is that, maybe we just start with an inventory, and we agree, absolutely, this is where you start. And I think we've seen that also with even vendors, that, the first thing you need to do is get an inventory. And that's really a core part of what we do with VLOX, is that we help you build a dynamic inventory that's really focused on business users as opposed to less than IT users, because IT may get a little too granular. You can really get the nuance of all the different ETLs and data attributes. We need a high level, like where are we with our inventory? And then you can figure out where you're going and how you need to move forward if you know where you are. So I think building strategy starts with really starting with where you are, what are going to be the ROIs that we need to, or sorry, the use cases we need to prioritize so we can get the best ROI, and then building that business case going forward. Not making an overcommitment to any particular vendors is something that we recognize, and that's why we think we have a very lightweight, very low engagement requirement for IT on using our platform. And I mean, we eat our own cooking, right? The advice and the recommendations we're giving are in alignment with what our platform does because we know that's the best way to start, and we've seen success already for plans that have adopted it.
We got one other question. It's from Jason
Mhm.
Lee.
Okay.
It's really about RADV audits. So Jason pointed out that the scope of RADV audits is sort of increasing exponentially. Um, any advice for, how can health plans stay ahead of that, and where might that overlap with some of the topics that we might talk about on on the future webinars related to fire, clinical data inventory, and ROI?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, we have a very specific instance in which we've met with one of our advisors that we meet with on an ongoing basis. And the approach that they have taken is that, and I use the word pipes, and I hope everybody understands. That's just like, how do we get the data from the provider into the plan? And what they discovered is they really kind of went agnostic. Let's stop building pipes according to the use case that it needs to be built for, and just say, let's get as much data as we possibly can into our environment, and then we can establish where the uses are that come up later. They came at it from the approach that we actually need it for quality measurement, so for HEDIS, but they focus on CCDs. And of course, we are preferential to fire for all the reasons that I think some of you are aware of and that we'll touch on continuously throughout the webinar series. But CCDs are out of the gate extremely useful because they're very broadly defined, meaning that what they found actually in that scenario by opening that up and allowing CCDs in and starting to deal with all the parsing, there's costs that's involved there, and they realized actually it was worth it. It was worth it because they saw tremendous improvement in the risk adjustments. And they also then had the documentation readily available to them to support the clinical documentation requirements for their risk adjustment. So again, that's building different use cases on top of an existing pipe is a really valuable exercise. And of course, because it's agnostic, you can use it for these other purposes as well. So it keeps coming back to the more data, the more low latency data you get, the better. Yeah, I don't know if I saw another question come in. We've run a little bit over, guys, but I don't mind hanging out. I'll let that be determined by the community.
I don't see any other questions, MC.
Okay, all right. Well, let's be respectful of time. Thank you very much for everybody for connecting. We look forward to seeing you again in our next webinar series. We'll make an announcement, I think, of that quite soon. Our intention is to get several more done before the end of the year. And so we'll continue to build on the discussions that we've been having here, and we'll definitely get more into the actual practical hows of clinical data operations and optimizing them to bring the most benefit both to your organization and to yourselves in your daily work. Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful holiday. Be safe, and we'll see you soon.